going to give it a minute for people to come in. We're getting started in just a moment, everyone. All right, well, while everyone's filing in, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. We're in a webinar room tonight, so we will not see you or hear you in the audience, but please, we encourage you to enter any questions or comments that you have in the chat feature at the bottom of our screen. If you shake your mouse, you'll see that speech bubble icon down there. I'm Erin Driscoll. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Wilmington Memorial Library. 2021 marks the 150th anniversary of the Wilmington Library, and as part of our celebrations this summer, we wanted to bring our community together around a great American novel, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The novel takes place in the Roaring '20s through a series of extravagant parties at Jay Gatsby's Long Island mansion, paid for, it becomes apparent, through bootlegging alcohol. Tonight we're going to get a glimpse of Prohibition-era Wilmington and the realities of bootlegging. I'm so excited to introduce Marian Leah Knapp, the author of Prohibition Wine, a true story of one woman's daring in 20th-century America. Marian is a writer and community activist. Her previously published books include Aging in Places, Reflective Preparation for the Future, A Steadfast Spirit, The Essence of Caregiving, and with Vivian Goldman, The Outermost Cape, Encountering Time. For more than 10 years, she's written a regular column for the Newton Tab. Welcome, Marian. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I just want to thank you so much and let you know how excited I am about being on this particular program, and the fact that I'm able to tie in with the community read of The Great Gatsby. So I don't know if people have had a chance to take a look at the book, but this book is about my grandmother, who spent most of her adult life in Wilmington, Massachusetts. And I heard stories about what it was like for her in Wilmington and for her children, one of whom was my father, who grew up in Wilmington. So when I was asked to do an event during your Great Gatsby month-long read, I was really excited about it, because immediately I began to think of the contrast between the people in the Great Gatsby who were not particularly likable people, and my grandmother, who was living in that exact same era, who was poor, struggling for every penny, and did not have parties like the people in the Great Gatsby did. So I was very happy to and pleased to have to be able to think about the contrast between my grandmother's life, which I'll explain to you, and the people in the Great Gatsby. So if you look at the first paragraph in The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald writes that I have to find it, yes, that Nick Carraway's father said to him, and this is a quote, "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I have been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all people in this world haven't had the advantages that you have had." So that's really, in a way, that's an introduction to this book about my grandmother. So Erin, if you can show that first photo of the people on the ship.
Absolutely.
My grandmother was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire, and she arrived in this country in the spring of 1889. And this is an old photograph of immigrants on a ship staring out at a camera. And it always strikes me that nobody knows who these people are. And any one of those faces on that ship could have been my grandmother or my grandfather or other relatives. And there's this photo. And then these people embarked in whatever port they came to in this country, and then they went their own ways, and no one ever knew what happened to them. What's their story? How did they get here? And what happened to them after they arrived? So for me, this is a really important image. And my goal in writing this book about my grandmother was to bring her story into the light as one of these anonymous people who came here to this country in the late 19th century into the 20th century, and who are still trying to come to America to have a better life. So these people and my grandmother represent those other people that did not have the same advantages that the Great Gatsby people had. So that's sort of the way I have been thinking about this book, and why I wrote it in the first place, is to bring up these stories of people into our present consciousness. So my grandmother arrived, as I said, in 1889. Her father had come here before her, and she had several older sisters that she came with. And then about a year later, her mother came with 4 younger children. And the normal way to get married at that time was, first of all, you had to wait until the older sister got married. And my grandmother was the 4th youngest girl, so she had to wait until all of her sisters got married before her. And she got married in 1900. And Erin, can you show that next? Can you do the previous picture? Yeah, that's my grandmother, Rebecca Warnick Goldberg. Now, a couple of things about this photograph. One is that she's wearing this fancy beaded dress. There was no way that she could have afforded to have a dress like that. And poor people rented clothing for a short amount of time, a few hours, to have a picture taken. And this picture was probably taken to show a potential husband, because it is highly likely that she had a matchmaker to find a husband for her. So there was a photograph that a photographer took in a formal way, and that photograph got passed around to various matchmakers, and they found a husband for her. And so can you go to the next slide? So this is actually the one before that. Can you, Erin? Yeah, this is their wedding photo. They were married in the very beginning of 1900. This is my grandmother, Rebecca. Again, her clothing was definitely rented. And that's my grandfather, Nathan, in a tuxedo, which he would never have been able to afford. And you can see that it's posed in front of a backdrop with columns and steps, very romantic. And again, this was a formal photograph, and there was actually the name of the photography studio on the bottom, if anybody can see that. But this was their marriage photo. So they were married probably through a matchmaker. And within the first 4 years of their marriage, she had 4 children, one right after the other. And they had a very difficult life. They were living, he was also an immigrant from the Russian Empire, and he ended up in Lowell, Massachusetts, probably because at that time, Lowell was one of the biggest industrial centers in the country. So he came to Lowell. He had several jobs, but had trouble settling down and finding a steady way of making a living. And because of that, they roamed around a lot. They went to different Massachusetts communities. They went to Pennsylvania. They went to New York. They went to Maine. They went basically all over and he was a peddler trying to sell goods out of a cart, a buggy, and horses, and it never worked. She would be in this cart with suckling a baby, and he was trying to sell flour and other goods like that. And it was a very, very difficult life. And her second child was my father, who was born in 1904. So what happened was, finally, there was somebody, my grandfather Nathan, found somebody who was selling property in Wilmington. Now, whether he knew Wilmington, but he just happened to bump into a speculator that was selling plots of land in Wilmington, and he bought 2 acres. Now, my grandmother thought it was a total ridiculous scheme. They had no money, but and she was angry about it. But he had already made the decision. She didn't really have much of a say. And so the family gradually moved to Wilmington, where he did a bunch of things. First of all, he dug a well, and he planted a garden, he planted trees, and he built a gigantic chicken coop. And Erin, can you go to the next? Yeah. So that's my grandfather with his bare feet on next to the porch at a house, the second house that he built in Wilmington. And that house is still there. It's on Fairview Avenue. But what had happened prior to this was that he had the original house that he built was made of wood and tar paper. And at that point, there were now, in the tar paper house, there were 6 children, plus my grandmother and he. And one morning, something caught fire in the house, and within minutes, the house was burnt to the ground. And they had nowhere to go because they had no other place to live, so they moved into the chicken coop. So they lived in the chicken coop, and as they lived in the chicken coop, he began to build another house, and that's the house that you can see in the back of this, in a background in this photograph. So when he was not quite finished with this house, the roof was not complete. But they did have an indoor bathroom. Before that, they had an outhouse. But before this house was completed, my grandfather died. And I was just talking to Erin about this. He was killed in a railroad accident at the South Wilmington Railroad Station. So I don't know if that station is still there, but my grandfather died. He was around 40 years old, and she was left with 6 children. They had actually started an egg business. So they were producing a lot of eggs in that chicken coop. And she would pack eggs in a suitcase and take one of the children, one of the younger children, in her hand, and in the other hand, she'd take this suitcase and get on the train in Wilmington and go into Boston and do a route in Boston with fresh eggs. And her customers were mostly family members, but also friends of the family. And that it took her to all of the Boston neighborhoods, to Boston itself, to Roxbury, to Mattapan, to Dorchester, to the West End, to the East Boston, and also to Chelsea. And she did that for a number of years, a couple of times a week, on the train, fragile eggs, a little kid in her hand, tromping through the streets of Boston, selling her eggs. So when her husband, Nathan, died, she had a partially finished house, 6 children, the oldest of whom was 16, and the youngest of whom was 2.5 years old. And she had to feed the family. So on one of her egg trips, she was in Chelsea, and her customer in Chelsea, a man, said to her, "Becky, you know, Prohibition is coming," which was, and I'll talk a little bit more about Prohibition and when that was enacted. "Prohibition is coming. You could sell a little illegal alcohol out there in Wilmington in the woods. The men there after work, they're going to really want something to drink. You could earn a little extra money." She was afraid. She was an immigrant. She thought she could get deported if she was breaking the law. But what choices did she have? She was determined to keep her family together and determined that her children would all graduate from high school, including her daughters, which was not common during that time. So Prohibition actually had a long history, or leading up to actually the passing of the Prohibition law, which was called the Volstead Act. And she just began to sell just in Wilmington, maybe a little in Woburn, but I'm not sure about that. But she just kept her business very, very local. And so, Erin, can you go to that next slide? Yeah, okay. So this is a newspaper headline from Westerville, Ohio, January 29th, 1919. Now, Prohibition happened because up until this point in 1919, various states were passing laws against alcohol, and they needed a certain number of states in order to make it illegal to have alcohol for the entire country. So I don't know if you can all see this, but I find this is such an interesting notice. Underneath this American issue, it says, "A saloonless nation and a stainless flag," is the subtitle of this. And then it says 36th state ratifies dry amendment January 16th, and Nebraska noses out Missouri for the honor of completing the job of writing the Dry Act into the Constitution. States were competing at that time to pass their laws so that they could be the most important states in this whole initiative to make the United States dry. So in 1919, it was voted yes, and that was only like 3 or 4 months after my grandfather died. So people during that year, it was enacted in 1920, and so during that year, everybody was figuring out either how to get rid of all of their stashes of alcohol or how to make their own. So my grandmother actually didn't make her own alcohol. This Chelsea customer was making this ethanol in the basement of the multiple family dwelling that he was living in Chelsea. And he told her, put a little alcohol in a bottle, add some water and a little bit of sugar that you brown in a pan, and it'll look like whiskey. Or just add water and it'll look like gin. Or you can make blueberry wine. Now, she actually knew how to make blueberry wine before this, but now this was a much bigger production. And the children were all involved in this illicit, illegal activity of producing alcoholic drinks. So the older kids would go, they were in Wilmington at that time, in that area, there were a lot of wild blueberry bushes, and I don't know if there are any still there 100 years later. And the children would go out with buckets and pick the blueberries and bring them home. She would boil them up on the stove and make a syrup, and thin enough syrup, mix it with a little bit more water, add some alcohol, and that was her famous blueberry wine. And the youngest one, who was 5, 6, 7 years old, would go through the dumps in the town or along the roads and look for bottles. And he would proudly bring home bottles for her to fill, especially if they were small, that they could, like a half pint or a pint. Oh, I see somebody that there are still wild blueberries growing. That's really nice to know. But those blueberries became a big staple for my grandmother's blueberry wine and other alcoholic beverages. And her first customer was a painter who she knew, a workman in the community, and he bought a bottle. And then he got the word out, let other people in the community know, and she had her own set of customers for her blueberry wine. Now, there's parts of this that I'm not going to tell you about on this, because I really think you would find it fun to read the book and understand exactly what happened. But she was selling alcohol in Wilmington on Fairview Avenue for about 5 years. And then one night, some people came to the door, in the back of the door, some men, and told her that they had heard she was selling alcohol and they wanted to buy a bottle. Now, she was always extremely cautious about selling to people that she didn't know. And so she would always ask them, who are you? Who sent you? What did you hear? What are you doing here? Finally, she agreed to leave a pint of alcohol, I'm not sure what kind, on the back stoop, and she left it there. And in the morning, she had, there was 75 cents left on the back stoop. And then within a couple of days, her house was raided by the police. Now, one interesting thing I think people might find really fun is that I have the roster of the Wilmington Police Department and the significant dates in the history of the police department in Wilmington. And here is the date, 1925. So it says, throughout the Prohibition era, liquor raids were common across most of the country. Wilmington's rural setting and proximity to Boston made it an ideal place for illegal liquor production. Chief Hill and special officers, along with state constabulary officers and federal prohibition agents, conducted a number of these raids. Now, one of those raids was my grandmother. And so when I read this, I'm 100 years separated from what happened that night or that evening or that day, but it's that legacy is still here. So my grandmother is a small little piece of the Wilmington Police Department's history, and especially in 1925. So what happened was she was called into court, as were a number of other people on that day, because Wilmington was a little hotbed of illegal alcohol sales. And the judge, okay, Erin, can you go to that next?
Yes,
that next one, next slide. Her family in Boston found her a lawyer, so she had legal representation. She was called before the judge. And this is the headline from August 11th, 1925, from the Daily Times, from Woburn, Winchester, Stoneham, Reading, Burlington, and Lexington. 2 cents for the newspaper. And the headline was, First Wilmington Liquor Case Dismissed by Court. Judge Jesse W. Morton frowns upon spotter evidence, chief called by the defense. So 2 things. The mention in the article from the police department that talked about special officers, those were called spotters. And basically they were hired to entrap people. The second thing is that the chief of police was called by my grandmother's defense lawyer to give her a character reference. But so I want you to read the book so you can understand what that meant in this, wasn't a trial, but it was this hearing. So the case against her was dismissed. And after that, she actually decided to stop selling illegal alcohol. But she had, during that time, she met two of her goals. One was to keep her family together, because the town of Wilmington offered to help her if the older children were taken out of school and sent to work. And she said, no way, my kids are going to graduate from high school. So first of all, she kept the family together. And her second goal was making sure that her kids had a high school education. And herself, on her own, with some help from various people, but as a widow, she met those goals. And her children, they all stayed together. They went out to work as they graduated from high school and brought money home to help support the household. And they did that up until the time that she died, which was in 1940. Now, I never knew my grandmother, and I only heard stories that from my childhood, when my father and my relatives would get together and they would talk about what it was like growing up in Wilmington in the 1910s, the 1920s, and what their life was like, being poor, participating in the illegal alcohol trade. So I would hear these stories. And as an adult, I decided that I needed to write a story about my grandmother and sort of to bring her into the light, like one of those anonymous immigrants on that ship that I showed right in the beginning. So it's been an incredible journey for me to learn about my grandmother, to learn so much about what it was like being an immigrant, what it was like being poor, what it was like breaking the law, and what women's lives were like at that time. And also now being a little bit connected back to Wilmington, which I hardly know at all, but I have visited. And so it's been quite a journey for me to do this. And coming back, so if you can think about the words that and the story that I've told about my grandmother, and contrast that to the life of the people in The Great Gatsby, where they were drinking alcohol like crazy, where they had all these fancy clothes and they drove fancy cars and they had big mansions, and they were all kind of figuring out what to do with their lives and what was, what dress to wear or their affairs. My grandmother was in that exact same time frame, and this was her frame of reference. Totally opposite and distant from that jazz Prohibition era that most of us hear about and think about. My grandmother did not have a speakeasy. She did not wear a fringe dress. She did not go out dancing. She did not do any of those things. She worked extraordinarily hard, very determined to put food on the table and to make sure the family stayed together and her kids got educated. That was her life in exactly the same time that the people in The Great Gatsby were living their lives. So I think I've covered most of it, and I'm love to answer questions. And I get people's reactions. I mean, this is your town. What do you think?
Thank you, Marian. And we have copies of Prohibition Wine at the library that you can check out, and it is also available for sale on Amazon or through the independent bookseller website as well. So definitely take a chance and check it out. It is quite the story, and again, just a tantalizing taste. There are quite a few prominent citizens, it seems, in Wilmington that were customers of Marian's grandmother. So she was quite entangled in the town. So please enter any questions you may have in the chat. And I know that I have some questions, Marian. you mention in your author's note of the book that your father and your uncle wrote their own autobiographies.
Right.
How did you, was that helpful for you? And how did you start your research for this?
Well, that's a great question, because my father really wanted to tell his story, going through this and what his life and how hard he had to work to just earn a living, and then finally being able to have his own family. So he wrote his autobiography when he was in his late 70s or early 80s. And so he did that. And then my uncle, the youngest one, the 2.5-year-old, who was 2.5 when his father died, also wrote his autobiography. And he actually was served in World War II, my Uncle Eddie. But his autobiography was focused on the fact that he didn't have a father when he was growing up and how difficult that was for him. Neither of their books were really of publishable quality. There was a ton of information, but not written in a way that were publishable. And I always thought, and I had interviewed my Aunt Lena, and I had always thought that someday I would combine all of their stories and write a book about them. And I, of course, read their writings over and over and over again. And I will never forget the morning I woke up and thought, I shouldn't write about them. They've already written about themselves. I need to write about their mother. And although there were little bits and pieces in their writings about their mother, and I heard some stories, they were little fragments of her history. So it took me 6 years to do all of the research, to try to verify some of the things that they said and learn things that I didn't know. So, for example, often immigrants will say, oh, they came from, well, in this case, Vilna, which is a city in the Russian Empire. And I would say, well, how did they get from Vilna to Boston? They just didn't fly over. They had to get from one place to another to get to a port, to a ship that would take them there. What was their route? How did they do that? So I did a lot of research on what common routes were. And the Russian Empire was huge. It was vast, incorporating multiple countries at that time. It was thousands of miles to a port that they could take a ship from. So that was one question. How did they get from one place to another? How did they get tickets? How did the money get to them for buying those tickets? So that's the kind of thing that every time I would come up with something, I would ask another question. And that question led to another whole arena of research. So I did research on the whole immigration, genealogy research, learned a whole lot about the family, about prohibition. I read dozens of books on prohibition. Women's issues, women's reproductive issues at that time, and what was available to poor women, and what the atmosphere in the country was at that time. So basically, that's what I did. That was my research. And also I learned a lot about trains. There were trains everywhere. Trains went little tiny spurs of trains, which are now mostly not there anymore. But that's how people got around before they had cars. It was either walking, a horse and buggy, or trains. So I learned a lot about that. And it was the Boston and Maine Railroad at the time. So that's the research that I did.
Excellent. Looks like we have a question in the chat from Terry. She loved your book and is wondering how popular Rebecca's boarding house was. Now, you mentioned in your book, and viewers at home who know a little Wilmington history might know that Silver Lake was quite the kind of a vacation destination back in the day, people
Right.
getting out of the city to the countryside. And Rebecca was quite entrepreneurial and ran a bit of a Silver Lake boarding house.
Right. Well, that's also a great question, because not only did Rebecca make wine and alcohol, but she was very entrepreneurial in other ways. And in fact, her egg business was kind of entrepreneurial. So once the house, that she had this house, which even wasn't finished very much, she would invite people from Boston who lived in this crowded, sometimes dirty environment, come to the country, stay for the weekend, and I'll cook you food, and I'll serve you, all kinds of things. And so it was a destination for many. Silver Lake was a destination for many people, but my grandmother was Jewish, and so she was able to provide kosher food in the country. And it was sort of like a little tiny mini Catskills like place. And in fact, that's how a lot of the hotels in the Catskills got started, was that people had a little house on the Catskills, and people from the New York City would go to the Catskills. So in a way, it was a little bit like that, only on a tiny little scale. So I think her place in the country was very popular among the people because they could take the train. It was not, I don't know how far, actually, it's a good question. I'm not sure how far Silver Lake is from Fairview Avenue. Does somebody have a guess about that? A mile or two. Well, a mile or two to walk in those days was nothing. It was just, my grandmother walked 2 miles just to get to work when she was living in Boston. So, it's a stroll. You walk a few miles, you might sit on the beach there and then walk home. That was really nothing at that time. Lost your sound.
So sorry. Am I back?
Yep, you're back.
Excellent. Have you been to visit the Fairview Ave house?
I visited it outside a number of years ago, and I actually recently was in touch with the current owner and told him that this story was coming up and some people might want to go look at it to sort of alert him. And so I don't want to say anything about him and, his compromise his privacy or anything, but the house is still there. I visited it a number of years ago, but have not been there recently. And it's something that I sort of would like to do soon.
Sure. Let's see. Okay. It looks like the Silver Lake
so
Depot
here's Paul. Yeah, the Silver Lake Depot was a 10-15 minute walk from, well, that's nothing.
Yeah, today people
even today, but that's
hot
people
property near the lake.
People walked. That's how they got around.
Yes. Terry also had a question, wondering why Rebecca was not buried in Wilmington.
Well, because she was buried in a Jewish cemetery, and the Jewish cemeteries are in Woburn. And so her family, tradition to bury people in the same cemetery from a family, if you can. So she had her she lost her youngest son. He was buried there, and her husband was buried there. And also, this actually gets more into the book, but she lost other family members very tragically. And they were all buried in that location, in the cemetery. And I have been there a lot. I've been to the cemetery in Woburn a lot and visited her grave and other relatives.
Oh, another question. From reading the book, it doesn't sound like Rebecca or Nathan were really big drinkers of alcohol. Do you know if she drank her own?
I doubt it. I mean, maybe she took a sip, but drinking really wasn't part of their tradition. It was more ritual. And in fact, that brings up a very interesting point, is that during the drive to legislate prohibition, it was divided on religious lines. So Protestants were against alcohol, but Catholics and Jews were not for alcohol necessarily, but because it was part of the religious ritual for both Catholics and Jews. So, but it wasn't, for Jews, it wasn't a big part of the culture. It was more used for ritual purposes.
Sure.
For for the Sabbath and for holidays.
Have you ever tried your hand at making her recipe?
It's really, somebody asked me, do I have the recipe for her blueberry wine? And I don't, but basically it's pretty simple. Get some blueberries, boil them up, strain it, put some sugar in and add a little alcohol. That's the recipe. The proportions, what I understand she did was she could put her finger in the mix and taste it, and she knew if the combination was right.
I hadn't really thought about in the book. I thought it was so funny that her friend tells her, add brown sugar if you want it to look like whiskey, the raw alcohol, not her wine.
Right.
Keep it clear if you want it to look like vodka or gin. I knew Prohibition alcohol probably wasn't the tastiest, but I didn't know how quite how bad.
But actually, I just want to say that's another thing that I learned, because I knew that she was selling alcoholic drinks, and I assumed that she had a still, but she didn't. Many people had stills, and I'm sure there were many stills in Wilmington at that time, but she didn't have a still. She just got this raw ethanol and mixed it up with other things.
We have a question if she ever went back to making wine after Prohibition was over, just for family or guests. Do you know?
Actually, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that, because Prohibition was over in 1932 or 3, I think. And she died in 1940. So there probably wasn't, and the children were mostly grown. Her family, her parents had died. And so there probably wasn't necessarily an occasion. And also she may have still had people come to visit her in the country on the weekends, but that whole business began to decline when more cars became more popular, because then people could go to New Hampshire or to Rhode Island or to wherever, and not only to Wilmington.
Interesting. Rereading The Great Gatsby this year in 2021, it's really struck me how, the book is of its time, and by some of the racism and the anti-Semitism in the novel, the book's clearly a product of anxieties surrounding, immigration and migration within the country. I'm sure they did. Did Rebecca and Nathan face a lot of anti-Semitism in Wilmington, in the city?
There's hints that there was anti-Semitism in Wilmington, but there was anti-Semitism everywhere. And I will say, I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island I was born in 1938, in the 1940s, and there was definitely anti-Semitism that I encountered. So it's been part of American culture for a long time, and sometimes it's worse and sometimes it's better, but has been an undercurrent for forever, really.
Certainly. It sounds like they were part of, they did have a community that they created with their Jewish relatives and neighbors and guests at Silver Lake.
Right, but they were from Boston. I do not know whether or not there were other Jews in Wilmington at that. I think there were a few, and maybe in the region there were more, but I'm not sure if they had a Jewish community in Wilmington itself.
Another question was in the chat is, did closing her alcohol business, was that a big financial problem for the family? It sounds like it had been quite a boon for them during those years.
Right. Well, there are two things. First of all, yes, the alcohol, I wouldn't call it a boon, but it allowed them, like the kids could go to the movies for a nickel on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon. or they could buy not shoes that were new and not hand-me-downs. So it raised their standard of living by, at the time, that was a significant change. But it was never rich, it was, and in fact, my father and my aunts and uncles wanted to buy her a new dress, a fancier dress. She didn't want it. She only wanted a new house dress. That's what she wanted. The other thing is that by the time this all was, I'm trying to remember, my father was working, the older sisters were working, they all had jobs in Boston, and they were bringing in money, and because that's what the children did. They worked and they brought money home, and then they may have had a few dollars left that they were allowed to take and go out and have, I don't know what they would do with the money, but they could, maybe have lunch with a friend or something like that. But mainly she was pretty much supported by her children. And also, and I want to mention this as well, also she still had the egg business. So she still raised the chickens and also vegetables, and she would sell those. But one of the things that I actually was kind of a revelation for me in doing this and thinking about it was that one reason she was able to do what she did is because she owned property. He bought this land, but mostly everybody else, nobody else in the family owned a house or a piece of land. So and she had a little tiny mortgage, like, I don't know, 50 cents a week or 50 cents a month, something like that. As long as she paid that mortgage, no one could evict her. No one could chase her off that land. It was hers, and the house was hers. So she had that stability as long as those modest bills got paid every month.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Well, yes, it's so true. The contrast between the excessive Gatsby parties we've been reading about this summer.
Right.
And that's one of the things I truly appreciated about your book, is it really kind of strips away some of the stereotypes we think of when we think of the Roaring '20s. We think of, crime syndicates and gangsters and flappers, and it's easy to forget that there were also just ordinary people, bootlegging to get by and to help their families.
Right. I just saw another question or a comment that it was amazing that my father went to college, which is true. I mean, it was an incredible thing that we as children felt, oh, our father went to college, when many kids' fathers went through the 8th grade and that was it. My father had not quite a distant kind of relationship with a cousin who was a very prominent editor in New York City. And I'm not sure how he decided, but he decided to help my father actually go on to college. And my father went to what was then Mass Agricultural College, which was Mass Aggie, and now it's UMass Amherst. So my father did graduate. He struggled, but he did finish college, which was an amazing feat for at that time.
Yes, and it sounds like education was quite a driving factor for Rebecca.
Right. And I can tell you, my aunts and uncles that I knew, because some of them died before I knew them, they were all very competent and capable, and all of them could have gone to college and done very well. But he was the one that they sent to college.
Thank you. Oh, let's see. Okay, so Paul says that relative to the population, there were a fairly significant Jewish population near Silver Lake, north and northeast, along Salem Street in Tewksbury and Wilmington. A synagogue was located there in the 1910s.
Okay. Well, thank you. I did not know that.
Yes, yeah. Excellent. And Marian, another question I wanted to make sure to ask you is if people are interested in uncovering their own family's stories, what would you recommend for them to get started in that research?
Right. Well, I used Ancestry.com a lot. I mean, that was my main source. There were other databases, but I found that it's pretty amazing what you can find on Ancestry.com, and you can build family trees. Now, if your family were, if they had names that were foreign names, like my family had, sometimes it takes a little bit of a lot of probing to actually find the people, because the spellings of the names were not necessarily how they got spelled once they were here for a while. So that's a bit of a challenge so you have to look for all kinds of clues. Like this happened when I was researching when my great grandmother came with her 4 younger children. I searched, the name was Wernick, but it was also spelled Vernick, where Wernik or ICK. So you have to go through that whole thing. And when I finally found, there was a group of people, her name was Anna, my great grandmother. And I found an entry that said Chane, which looks like chain, but in Yiddish, that's Hannah, which is Anna, which is Anne, right? And then 4 children whose names didn't match the names that I knew of her children, but I looked at it. I looked at the ages of the children and where they were headed, and it was like, that's it, so it took me many explorations to pull out that data. So it's a chore. You have to really want to do it, but it's really interesting.
Yes. A quick library plug, you can get access to Ancestry.com through the Wilmington Memorial Library website.
Oh, great. Yeah. And so it's a fascinating thing to do that kind of genealogical research.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for that advice. And okay, we have a quick question in the chat. When did your grandmother pass? Oh, sorry. When your grandmother passed, did family members remain in town, or did they move to other areas? Any remaining connections in Wilmington?
Actually, that's a really great question. My father, the oldest daughter, had gotten married and had left Wilmington, but there was a tragedy around her, so she died actually within months of her mother, my grandmother. So she wasn't there anymore. My father had moved to Rhode Island, and that's where I grew up. And others of the children lived in the Boston area mainly. And my aunt Lena, who I've mentioned before, she actually stayed home until her mother died. So she was the one that was still home when the house got sold, which would have been somewhere around 1940.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Marian, for sharing your grandmother's story with us tonight and giving us a glimpse into Prohibition-era Wilmington. I really recommend that everyone check out Prohibition Wine. It's a fascinating story, and it really gives you some insight into the, the ins and outs of bootlegging in that time. Thank you, Marian, and
thank you. I'm thrilled to be able to be with you and to tell this story to Wilmingtoners.
Yes, I know I've certainly learned a lot more about the town from reading your book. Thank you.